Well, as expected, From Software just released their first patch for Shadow of the Erdtree, patch 1.12.3, complete with some balancing changes and bug fixes. However, it isn't as many changes as I think many players anticipated, myself included, so I expect more changes to come down the road. But for now, let's get into what the highlights of this patch are. There were a lot of nerfs this patch, but there were a couple of buffs as well, so we'll start with those first. First up is the Carrion Sorcery Sword. The Carrion Sorcery Sword had its intelligence scaling increased and base damage decreased. Hopefully this means that now it'll actually be viable as a casting weapon, and that the base damage decrease was to compensate for the increased damage from the scaling. Before, this weapon's sorcery scaling was so bad that when we looked into making a build for it, Kaz simply couldn't make one that he thought would be worth it. Hopefully this patch will change that and we'll actually be able to use it in an upcoming build. We'll definitely be doing a few tests. The other buff is that the Smith's Grip Dagger and the Smith's Grip Cirque had their throwing ranges extended. This is a great change as these still put you in danger of some melee attacks when using them previously due to the short range of these weapons compared to other ranged weapons. You can look forward to our build showcasing the dagger tomorrow, and I think you'll find it's even better now than what you see in that video. Now onto the nerfs. The weapon skill Rolling Sparks for perfume bottles was dealing way more damage than intended, so that's been tweaked. Previously, players could unlock their camera from the enemy, look at their feet, and then deal massive damage by spamming this Ash of War. So it's likely that this will no longer be a thing, and I'm unsure if other damage was reduced. This is definitely a change that we all saw coming as bosses were getting two-shot, and people were beating the final boss in a few hits. The weapon skills Discus Hurl and Feeble Lord's Frenzied Flame are no longer boosted by right-hand buffs. Obviously, buffing right-hand weapons is not supposed to buff left-hand weapons, as we found out with Determination and Royal Knight's Resolve way back at the launch of Elden Ring, so that's a good bug fix. Next up, Lightning and Frenzied Flame perfume bottles were dealing double damage sometimes. We haven't really messed around with these too much yet, though we did do a build on the fire version, but it seems these two specifically had bug damage sometimes. That's been fixed now, so if you're using those weapons, you will see a damage decrease. The Bloodfiend's Arm Colossal Weapon has had its arcane scaling reduced when selecting other affinities, and also had the status effect build-up of its heavy attacks reduced. If you've been poking around at Reddit or YouTube for some cheese builds, you're very likely to have found this weapon all over the place for bleed builds that can trigger blood loss easily. Too easily. And this was clearly overtuned. We tend to stay away from these types of things when making builds early on, as it's likely that they'll get nerfed and builds will become obsolete. But you may see a build with this weapon now in the future. Next up, the Fire Knight's Greatsword has had some tweaks. It looks like they made a few changes to player hitboxes and the attack affinity. Not sure how this will shake out specifically since they left it pretty vague, but my guess is that these are slight nerfs as well, since I know this is a very popular weapon at the moment. We will be getting to a build with this weapon in the future, so stay tuned for that. Going back to Smith's Script weapons, all of them had nerf damage with some affinities. We haven't tested all of these yet, so we're unsure why these were nerfed. Maybe throwing damage was too high with some affinities, so they had to be lowered. We'll see. The next one is a pretty big change. NPC behavior has been fixed for some boss fights. This is a great overall change in my opinion because most summons seem to do almost nothing a lot of the time and aren't even worth using. Hopefully this makes things a bit easier for those who wish to use summons and that NPCs operate a bit more as intended rather than just existing to scale the boss's HP up. Another small change, but one that I found really nice, is that the Golden Hippo boss fight has had its unblockable grab attack fixed, and it no longer has a hitbox larger than the entirety of Limgrave. Great change. And lastly, there have been several other performance and bug fixes. We have no details on what specifically they changed, but the DLC was rampant with bugs, probably more so than any From Software game I've seen recently, so this was definitely a good area to focus on. Hopefully the performance has now also improved as there was intermittent stuttering for most of my playthrough. I would see the boss wind up an attack, my screen would freeze, and then I'd be dead. It wasn't always game breaking like that, but it was pretty annoying, so hopefully they fixed it. So that about wraps up our patch video. Some of these changes were pretty expected, but there are still many balancing changes coming, I'm sure. One thing I'm pretty surprised we didn't see on this patch was the final boss's infamous cross-slash move, which has garnered a lot of attention as being pretty hard to dodge. There are also still tons of skills and spells that hit too hard or hit like a wet noodle, so we'll see what comes in the next couple of weeks. What did you guys think of the patch? Do you think they hit the right spots here? Did you expect most of these changes? And what would you guys like patched in the future? Let us know in the comments below.